She had spent $4 million trying to give her daughter back the sound of her own name. And every single specialist had failed. Then a maintenance technician, a man with grease on his hands and secrets buried so deep, even his personnel file couldn't find them, crouched down at a corporate family picnic, watched an 8-year-old girl press her fingers behind her ear, and went completely still. He had seen that exact reaction before. Not in a hospital. Not in a clinic. In a classified communications bunker 12 feet underground, where poorly shielded military equipment was slowly destroying the hearing of the men operating it. Camille Arkwright caught him staring at her daughter and felt her blood turn cold. She crossed the lawn in 6 steps. "If you think you know something my specialist missed," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "then help her." The man looked up at her. And for the first time in 3 years of fighting this battle alone, Camille saw something in a stranger's eyes that she hadn't expected. Not pity, not the practiced sympathy of someone about to hand her a brochure. Recognition. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end, because this one goes places I promise you will not see coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Camille Arkwright turned 30, her assistant sent a car to collect her from the penthouse. A florist delivered 3 dozen white peonies to her corner office on the 14th floor, and her board of directors arranged a catered breakfast in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. She ate 4 bites of a croissant standing at the window, answered 11 emails before 9 o'clock, and spent the rest of the morning on a call with the European division trying to stop a regulatory issue from becoming a public relations disaster. She did not think about her birthday again until she walked through the front door of her home at 7:45 that evening and found Rosie sitting at the kitchen table with a construction paper banner taped crooked across the cabinet that read "Happy Birthday, Mom" in bright orange letters. Camille stopped in the doorway. She set her bag down on the floor. "You made this yourself?" she said. Rosie looked up, watching her mother's face the way she always did, reading lips, reading expressions, pulling meaning from the shape of a mouth and the angle of eyes with the kind of quiet concentration that most adults never noticed, and almost all of them underestimated. She nodded. Then she signed, "I asked Mrs. Henley how to spell birthday. She told me wrong." Camille laughed. It came out rough and tired and completely genuine, and she crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled her daughter into her arms and held on longer than she meant to. That was the thing people outside her life never understood. They looked at Camille Arkwright and saw the woman on the covers of business magazines, composed, precise, expensive. They saw the CEO who had taken a struggling mid-sized technology firm and rebuilt it into something worth 9 figures in 11 years. They saw the settlement from her divorce, the penthouse, the fleet of company vehicles, the assistant who seemed to materialize with whatever she needed before she realized she needed it. They did not see what happened at 7:45 on a Tuesday when a banner with a misspelled word could completely break her open. Rosie had been diagnosed with bilateral sensorineural hearing loss at age 3. The pediatric audiologist had explained it calmly, with charts and measured language, and a pamphlet that Camille had read so many times the creases had gone white. The condition was significant. The causes were likely multifactorial. Early intervention was strongly recommended. Camille had intervened early. She had intervened continuously and extensively, and with the full financial force of someone who genuinely could not accept a problem that money was supposed to be able to solve. She had taken Rosie to 4 different audiologists in 3 states before Rosie turned 5. She had commissioned private assessments. She had purchased the most advanced hearing aid technology available. Then the generation after that, then the one after that. She had hired a speech-language pathologist who worked exclusively with pediatric hearing loss patients, a sign language instructor who came to the house 3 mornings a week, and a specialist in pediatric auditory processing who had flown in from out of state twice and charged accordingly. The results had been the word every single professional used, in slightly different arrangements, was complex. Rosie's hearing loss was real, and it was significant, but her responses to sound were inconsistent in ways that didn't map neatly onto the testing results. Sometimes she seemed to catch frequencies that the audiograms suggested she shouldn't be able to detect. Other times she went entirely flat in environments where her equipment should have been giving her good access. The specialists called it variability. They called it the nature of sensorineural loss. They called it within expected parameters and not unusual given the profile. And Camille had learned to smile and nod in those offices while something inside her went tight and stayed that way. She was not a woman who accepted within expected parameters. She was also not a woman who knew how to stop pushing when pushing was the only language she had left. Darren Voss had worked for Camille for 6 years, and in that time he had become one of the 3 people in the company whose judgment she actually trusted. He was 41, meticulous, and had a gift for making complex technical systems feel manageable. He oversaw the company's entire technology infrastructure, the server architecture, the security systems, the wireless networks that ran across both the corporate headquarters and the residential properties that Camille's security arrangements required to be integrated. He was also the person who had recommended the wireless security system that now ran through every wall of her mansion and the 2 research facilities her company operated. Camille had not known, when she approved that system, that Darren had negotiated terms she never saw. She did not know a lot of things about Darren Voss. But none of that had surfaced yet on the morning of the corporate family event, which was held on the 2nd Saturday of October, at the grounds adjacent to the company's primary research facility, an annual tradition that Camille had started 4 years ago, partly because her HR director had suggested it, and partly because it gave Rosie somewhere to be while Camille moved through the spaces between work and the life she kept telling herself she was going to start building. The event was exactly what these things always were. Tent, tables, a catered spread that was trying to feel casual. Employees with their families, a little stiff in the first hour and looser by the second. Children running between adults' legs. Someone's toddler aggressively pursuing a balloon. Camille worked the event the way she worked every room present, appropriate, attentive enough to make people feel seen without giving so much of herself that she'd have nothing left for the following Monday. She had learned that particular skill in her 20s and polished it until it was invisible. Rosie stayed close to her for the first half hour, then drifted toward a cluster of children near the far end of the tent, which was what Camille both wanted for her and quietly agonized over every single time it happened. She watched her daughter approach 2 girls who looked around her age. She watched the moment when the communication gap appeared, that slight hesitation, that recalibration. The way Rosie's face did something careful when she realized the other children didn't know how to talk to her yet. It was not dramatic. It was small and practiced, and it happened fast, and most people at that event probably didn't notice it at all. Camille noticed it every time. She was turning back toward the beverage table when she saw the man. He was crouched near a portable speaker setup, about 30 feet from where Rosie was standing, part of the maintenance crew, judging by the company badge and the utility vest with too many pockets. Late 30s, maybe. Not especially remarkable, except for the fact that he was completely motionless, looking at her daughter with an expression that Camille couldn't immediately categorize. Not creepy, not intrusive, something else, focused. She covered the distance between them in about 12 seconds. "Excuse me," she said. He didn't startle, which she noticed. Most people startled when Camille Arkwright walked up behind them at company events. He looked up slowly, unhurried, and Camille got her first clear look at his face. He had the kind of tired around the eyes that came from something more specific than bad sleep. A small scar crossed the left edge of his chin. His hands resting on his knees were absolutely still. "You've been watching my daughter for 4 minutes," Camille said. She kept her voice low and level, which she found was always more effective than raised. He didn't apologize, and he didn't get flustered. "I noticed something," he said. "What exactly did you notice?" He glanced back toward Rosie, who was now sitting cross-legged in the grass, while one of the girls from before demonstrated something with her hands, badly attempted sign language, probably, which Rosie was too polite to correct. "Every time that speaker activates," he said, "she presses 2 fingers behind her right ear. Same spot, same pressure. She's been doing it consistently for the last few minutes." Camille looked at Rosie, then she looked back at him. "She has hearing loss," Camille said, and the words came out harder than she intended, carrying years of waiting rooms and test results and well-meaning professionals behind them. "She presses on her ear because her equipment is uncomfortable sometimes." "I understand," he said. "I'm not saying I know what her condition is." But that specific gesture fingers behind the ear at that location, responding to that kind of electronic activation, I've seen it before. Not in a medical setting. Then where? He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes, like a door closing quietly. Somewhere I used to work, he said. It doesn't matter. He stopped. Started again. What kind of hearing technology is she using? Camille stared at him. He waited. You're a maintenance technician, she finally said. Yes, and you have some theory about my daughter's medical equipment. Not a theory, an observation. She should have walked away. She knew how to walk away from conversations. She did it 10 times a week with people who were far more credentialed than a man in a utility vest crouching by a portable speaker at a company picnic. But she had been in that fight for 5 years, and she was very, very tired. If you think you know something my specialist missed, she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and did not try to soften it, then help her. Something in his face settled. I can't promise us anything, he said immediately. I'm not a doctor. I can't treat anything. I'm not asking you to treat anything. And I don't want any money. That was strange enough that it stopped her. Everyone wants money, she said. Not for this. He stood up. He was taller than she'd realized. My name is Tobias Kincaid. I work third rotation maintenance in Building C. If you want me to look at the technical environment around your daughter, not your daughter, the environment around her, I'll do that. On my own time. With no guarantees. Camille studied him for a long moment. Why? She said. He glanced back at Rosie. Because I have a daughter, he said. And if someone noticed something about her that I'd missed, I'd want them to say something. It was not a polished answer. It was not the answer of someone who had prepared for this conversation or rehearsed a pitch. It came out rough and a little reluctant, like something he hadn't planned to say. That was the thing that made her believe him. Fine, she said. But if this turns out to be nothing, then it turns out to be nothing, he said simply. And I go back to third rotation maintenance. She went home that evening and sat in Rosie's doorway after her daughter had fallen asleep, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing and doing what she always did in those quiet moments, running through every decision she had made and wondering which ones had been wrong. The divorce. The years she had spent traveling for work when Rosie was small. The specialist she had trusted. The ones she hadn't trusted enough. The security system that Darren had recommended and that she'd signed off on without reading the full technical specifications, because she was managing 4 other crises that month, and she'd trusted Darren. She always came back to trust eventually. Trust was the thing she had the least of and spent the most time thinking about. Her phone buzzed. A message from the company directory lookup she'd run on the way home. Tobias Kincaid. Employee since 3 years prior. Clean record. Prior employment listed as general contracting. Military service 7 years U.S. Navy. Discharge status honorable. She read it twice. 7 years Navy. General contracting was a thin cover for whatever had come between those two things. She set the phone down. She looked at Rosie. She thought about a man who had noticed something in 4 minutes that 4 years of specialists had apparently not considered. And she decided that she wasn't done yet. Tobias found his daughter asleep on the couch when he got home, her shoes still on, a book open on her chest. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her. Molly was 9 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's complete inability to go to bed when she was supposed to. She had also, apparently, spent the last 3 hours teaching herself the sign language alphabet from a library book she'd checked out on her own, which he discovered when he found the book still open in her lap to a page with hand diagrams. He didn't know why she'd checked it out. He'd ask her in the morning. He carried her to her room, took her shoes off, and pulled the blanket up. She made a small sound, but didn't wake. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter in the quiet. He hadn't planned to say anything at the event. He never planned to say anything about anything. It was a habit built over years in circumstances where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could cost more than he wanted to think about. He had gotten good at observing. He had gotten good at logging what he saw and keeping it to himself. But that girl pressing her fingers behind her ear with that particular combination of frequency response and location, he hadn't been able to let it go. Because he had seen that before, not in a child. In a trained communications operator who had been working in a facility with interference problems that nobody had properly diagnosed for 8 months, and by the time they figured it out, the damage was done. He thought about Camille Arkwright. He'd known who she was before today. You worked for a company long enough, you knew who the CEO was. But knowing who she was and standing 2 feet from her while she looked at him, like she was deciding whether to fire him or take a chance on him, were two different things. She was not what he'd expected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Someone smoother, maybe. Someone more practiced at managing people from a careful distance. She'd been tired. He'd seen it under the composure, the particular exhaustion, of someone who had been fighting the same fight for a very long time and was starting to wonder if they were fighting it right. He understood that feeling. He went to bed knowing he was going to look at whatever she showed him, and knowing that what he found might be nothing. He went to bed also knowing, somewhere quieter than thought, that it probably wasn't nothing. Because that gesture, that specific gesture, he had seen it before. And the last time he'd seen it, there had been a transmitter involved that nobody was supposed to know about. Camille had not slept well in 3 years, so the fact that she lay awake until 2 in the morning, the night after the corporate event, was not unusual. What was unusual was what she was thinking about, not the European regulatory issue, not the quarterly numbers her CFO had flagged, not the deposition she had scheduled for the following Thursday regarding a vendor contract dispute that had been dragging through legal for 8 months. She was thinking about a maintenance technician crouching by a portable speaker with his hands completely still on his knees. She got up at 2:15, went to the kitchen, made coffee she didn't really need, and stood at the window looking at the city below while she tried to talk herself out of it. The rational argument was simple. She had already worked with the best pediatric audiologists in the country. She had spent more money on Rosie's hearing care than most people spent on houses. She had left no professional stone unturned. The idea that a man in a utility vest with a military background she couldn't verify and a job description that involved changing light bulbs and calibrating HVAC systems might see something 4 years of. Medical specialists had missed was absurd. It was the kind of desperate thinking she had promised herself she was done with 2 years ago, after the third specialist she'd flown in from out of state had looked at her with that particular mixture of sympathy and professional limitation, and said the words within expected parameters, and she had driven home with her hands so tight on the steering wheel that her knuckles ached for 2 days. She was not desperate. She was a woman who made decisions based on evidence and information. She called his direct line at 7 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. "I want to be clear about something before we start," she said, without greeting. "If this goes nowhere, I expect you to say so immediately. I don't need people in my life who manage my feelings instead of telling me the truth." A pause. "Understood," Tobias said, "and I want to see your process. Whatever you look at, whatever conclusions you reach, I want the reasoning, not just the result. I've had too many experts hand me conclusions and expect me to nod. That's fine. I can give you access to Rosie's device records going back to her first fitting. Previous technical assessments. Audiograms. I'll have my assistant pull everything. I'd also like the technical specifications for your building systems," he said. "Both the mansion and the research facility." She stopped. "Why the buildings?" "Because I don't think the problem is with Rosie," he said. "I think the problem might be around her." She stood there in her kitchen for a moment, with the coffee going cold in her hand. "You have 2 weeks," she said. "And if you find something, you bring it to me first. Not to anyone else on the team, not to other employees. To me, yes," he said, and Tobias. "Yeah, if you're wasting my time, I'll know it. I'm very good at knowing when I'm being managed." He was quiet for a beat. "I know," he said, "I could tell." The files arrived on his personal laptop by noon, a compressed archive, organized with a kind of precision that suggested whoever had put it together had done it on very little sleep and was not going to be asked twice. Rosie's audiogram history going back to her initial diagnosis. Device fitting records. Every adjustment made to her hearing technology over 4 years, logged by date and technician. Previous technical assessments from 3 different specialists, 2 of them running to 20 pages apiece. Tobias read all of it. He read it the way he used to read site assessments in the Navy, not looking for what was there, but looking for what didn't line up. Inconsistencies. Data points that the analyst had explained away in a footnote instead of investigating. places where two pieces of information sat next to each other without anyone apparently noticing that they contradicted. He found the first one on page 12 of the oldest specialist report. The audiologist had noted that Rosie's responses in the testing booth were notably stronger than expected based on device calibration. She had attributed this to the controlled acoustic environment of the testing room. She had moved on. Tobias did not move on. He went back through every testing record in the file and mapped Rosie's response profiles against the locations where each test had been conducted. The pattern was not subtle once you were looking for it. In quiet environments, the audiologist's testing booth, the speech therapist's office, the one occasion where Rosie had been tested at a facility outside the city, her responses were consistently better than her general profile suggested they should be. She was catching things. Not everything, not clearly, but something was getting through that didn't get through in other settings. In Camille's mansion, the responses logged by the at-home care providers were consistently worse. Speech therapist notes written with careful professional language that couldn't quite hide. The therapist's confusion mentioned that Rosie seemed to have significantly more difficulty with her assistive technology at home than she did during clinic sessions. The therapist had raised this with Camille. Camille had raised it with the device manufacturer. The manufacturer had done a remote diagnostic and reported no issues with the equipment. Tobias pulled up the technical specifications for Camille's home security system. Then he pulled up the specifications for the wireless infrastructure at the research facility. He sat with both documents open side by side for a long time. He called Camille at 4:30 in the afternoon. "I need to come look at the physical spaces," he said. "Both locations. I need to bring some equipment." "What kind of equipment?" "RF signal analyzer, spectrum scanner. A few things I have from before," he caught himself. "From previous work." She didn't ask about the previous work. "Not yet." "When?" she said. "Tomorrow evening, after the facility closes. I'll arrange access." "Don't tell anyone else I'm coming," he said. "Don't tell your technology director. Don't tell your security team. Just you." A longer pause this time. "That's a strange request," she said carefully. "I know. Are you going to tell me why?" "Not yet. Because I might be completely wrong. And if I'm wrong, I don't want to have caused you a problem. But if I'm right," he stopped. "If I'm right, I'll tell you everything. And you'll want to be sitting down." She met him at the research facility at 6:15 the next evening, in a nearly empty parking lot with the October sky going gray and cold behind her. He was already there, leaning against a nondescript truck that definitely hadn't come from the company motor pool, with a duffel bag and a hard-sided equipment case that looked like it had been around the world at least twice. She looked at the case. "You carry that in the back of your truck," she said. "Old habits," he said. They went in through a side access she had coded for him, and he walked the building differently than she expected. Not aimlessly, systematically, but without announcing what he was doing. He moved through corridors with the equipment scanning and his eyes tracking the walls and ceilings, with a patience that was slightly unnerving to watch. Camille had prepared herself to feel foolish. She had mentally rehearsed what she would say when this turned out to be nothing, how she would thank him professionally and close the door on this particular detour. She did not feel foolish. She felt something else that she couldn't name yet. 40 minutes in, he stopped in a corridor near the building's main server room and crouched down. He pulled a secondary piece of equipment from the bag and held it near the baseboard while watching the readout. "Come here," he said. She crouched beside him. He held up the scanner. "This is showing RF signal activity in a frequency band that the building's documented wireless infrastructure doesn't operate in." She looked at the readout. Numbers she didn't know how to interpret. Meaning what? Meaning something in this building is broadcasting on a channel that isn't on the official network map. He stood. "Have you had the wireless systems independently audited recently?" "Darren manages all of that. He does quarterly audits internally." "Independently," Tobias said, "outside the company." She looked at him. "No," she said. "That's what I figured." He was careful with it. He didn't push. He simply moved on to the next corridor, and then the next, and the readings came up again in 3 more locations, once near the secondary server bay, once in the hallway closest to the building's Eastern Communications hub, and once, which neither of them commented on immediately, directly adjacent to the room that Rosie used when she came to the facility with Camille on school holidays. Camille stood in the doorway of that room for a moment. It was a small space, a couch, a table, a television. A room they'd set up so Rosie could be comfortable while her mother worked. Rosie had spent hours in this room with her homework and her books and her devices. "How long has this frequency been active?" she asked, and her voice came out very flat. "I don't know," Tobias said from behind her. "I can't determine that from what I'm seeing here. I'd need the historical transmission logs." He paused. "If they still exist." She turned to look at him. "What does that mean, if they still exist?" "It means systems like this can be configured to log or not to log. And if someone set this up and didn't want questions about it, they'd choose not to log." "Tobias." She kept her voice steady. "I need you to tell me plainly what you think is happening." He held her gaze for a moment. "I think someone installed a transmitter in this building that isn't documented in your official network specs. I think that transmitter is broadcasting in a frequency range that would create significant interference with sensitive medical-grade wireless equipment." He paused. "I think your daughter's hearing aids are sophisticated devices that operate in a frequency band that is vulnerable to exactly this kind of interference. And I think the reason her performance in this building is consistently worse than it is in clinical settings is because every time she's here, something is actively fighting the signal her devices are trying to use." The corridor was very quiet. "Are you telling me," Camille said slowly, "that my building has been jamming my daughter's hearing aids?" "I'm telling you it's possible. I'm not certain yet." His voice was even. "But yes, that's what the readings suggest." She put her hand against the wall. She thought about Rosie pressing her fingers behind her ear at the family event. She thought about 4 years of inconsistent results that nobody had been able to explain. She thought about the speech therapist's notes about how Rosie struggled more at home, and the at-home care providers saying the same thing, and every specialist attributing it to the variability of sensorineural loss, which was real and which Camille had accepted, because what else was she supposed to do? She thought about Darren Voss, who had recommended this security system, who had overseen its installation, who had managed every technical audit since. "The security system," she said. "Darren handled all of it." "Yes," Tobias said. "You think he knows?" Tobias didn't answer immediately. "I think someone knows," he said carefully. "I don't know who yet. But this kind of transmitter doesn't install itself, and it doesn't operate for months or years without someone maintaining it." She pushed off the wall and started walking back toward the exit, and Tobias kept pace without being asked. "I need the transmission records," she said. "Everything the system has logged." "I know. Tonight. Camille." He said her name plainly, without the deference that most of her employees wrapped around it. "If someone set this up intentionally, and if they're watching the network, which they may be, pulling those records will alert them. You need to be very careful about how you do this." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him in the corridor, in the institutional light that made everything look tired. "How careful?" she said. "Go through channels you don't normally use. Careful. Access points they wouldn't expect you to use, and do it before they realize you know to look." She studied him. "You're very good at thinking about things like that," she said. He didn't respond to that directly. "Let's look at your house next," he said. The mansion took longer because it was larger, and because Tobias was thorough in a way that didn't allow for shortcuts. He moved through every room with the same systematic patience, and Camille walked behind him in her own home, feeling like a stranger in it, seeing it through whatever lens he was looking through, and not liking what that felt like. The readings at the house were worse, not dramatically worse. Not the kind of worse that came with blinking lights and alarms. But consistently, quietly, pervasively worse, a low-grade interference pattern, woven through the walls and floors, like something that had settled in so gradually that nobody had ever noticed the moment it arrived. Tobias stood in the kitchen and showed her the readout without speaking. "Her bedroom," Camille said. "I haven't been there yet." "Come on." Rosie's bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a room that Rosie had decorated herself over 2 years, posters of animals, and a bookshelf full of both picture books and chapter books. She read with a slightly tilted intensity that her teachers mentioned in every conference. The bed had too many pillows. There was a dream catcher hung in the window that Rosie had made in art class and been extraordinarily proud of. Tobias stood in the center of the room with the scanner running. The readout spiked, not huge, not dramatic, just higher. Notably, measurably higher than anywhere else they'd been that evening, including the corridor adjacent to the server room at the facility. "She sleeps here," Camille said. "I know every night."
I know.
He lowered the scanner. He wasn't looking at it anymore. He was looking at the bookshelf, the posters, the too many pillows on the small bed. The closer the source of interference is to the device during use, the more significantly it degrades performance. A sleeping child with hearing aids, and even some kids, sleep with them in, or have them nearby. "She doesn't sleep with them in," Camille said. "The audiologist told us not to." "Okay, but proximity still matters for calibration drift and cumulative wear on the signal processing components." He paused. "And if she has a monitor or any wireless device near the bed?" "She has a hearing loop system. I installed a hearing loop throughout the house so she'd have ambient audio assistance." Tobias went still. "The hearing loop runs through the bedroom?" "Through the whole house." He looked at the readout again. "The hearing loop would be especially sensitive to this kind of interference," he said. "It operates in a frequency range that." He stopped. He seemed to be deciding how technical to get. It would make everything worse. The hearing loop, the aids, the combination in this environment, with that interference pattern, the systems you set up to help her would actually be working against itself. Camille sat down on Rosie's bed. She sat there in her daughter's room with the dream catcher in the window and the too many pillows and the bookshelf of books her daughter read with that determined intensity, and she put her hands flat on the quilt and stared at the floor. "For how long?" she said. Not a question, just the words into the air. Tobias didn't answer, because he didn't know, because neither of them knew yet. She sat there for almost 2 minutes without speaking, and he stood in the doorway and let her. "I'm going to need the records," she said finally. "Yes, and I'm going to need you to help me get them in a way that doesn't warn whoever is on the other end of this." "Yes," and then she stopped. Her voice had done something she didn't want it to do. She pulled it back into line, "And then I'm going to need you to tell me who taught you to think like this." He leaned against the doorframe. He looked at the dream catcher in the window. "The Navy," he said. "We used to go into communications environments before a site went active. Check for things that weren't supposed to be there. Transmitters that weren't on any schematic, signals that didn't belong." He paused. "We called them ghost frequencies, signals that someone had worked very hard to make invisible." "And you found a lot of them?" "Enough," he said. "Enough to know what they look like." She stood up. She smoothed the quilt where she'd been sitting, automatically, the way you do in someone else's space even when it's your own house. She turned to face him. "Who are you?" she said, not angry this time. Not challenging. Just the question straight. He met her eyes. "Someone who used to find problems people worked very hard to hide," he said. They spent the next 4 days moving carefully. Tobias worked his regular shifts in Building C and came to Camille's office after hours, through a side entrance she'd given him access to, using a badge that bypassed the main security log. She had an IT contractor she'd used for a previous project not affiliated with Darren's team. Not on the company's internal roster do a quiet, independent network pull from a physical access point that the main system wouldn't show in its standard activity log. The records came back partial. Someone had been into the system. Not all of the logs were gone. The deletion had been fast and probably done under time pressure, because it was incomplete, the way a person clears a room when they know someone is coming and they're rushing. There were gaps, deliberate, targeted gaps, but around the edges of those gaps, in the records that hadn't been caught in the sweep, pieces remained. Tobias and Camille sat across from each other in her office at 11:30 on a Thursday night, with the records spread across 2 monitors and takeout containers going cold on the conference table, and built the picture slowly, piece by piece, the way you build something in the dark when you only have half the parts. The transmitter had been active for at least 14 months. Possibly longer. The earlier logs were gone. It operated on a rotating frequency cycle that moved systematically through a range that covered both the hearing aid band and the hearing loop system frequency. It had been configured remotely. The access codes used for its configuration matched a set that traced back partially, incompletely, but traceable to a user account inside the company's technology division. Tobias didn't say the name. He let Camille see it herself. She stared at the access log for a long time. "Darren," she said. Tobias didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The record was there. "The interference," she said. She stopped. Was it? I don't think it was targeted at Rosie, he said. He was careful with this. I don't think whoever set this up was thinking about your daughter. I think the transmitter was put in place for something else entirely. I think the interference was a side effect, an unintended consequence. Something Darren either didn't realize or didn't care about, because fixing it would mean explaining why the transmitter existed. What was it for then? Tobias leaned back. He'd spent 2 days on that question. Data, he said. The frequency pattern and the transmission cycle, it's consistent with a covert data relay. Something that piggybacks on the facility's existing wireless infrastructure to move information out of the building without showing up on the official network traffic reports. He paused. The kind of thing you set up when you're moving data you don't want showing up on the official network traffic reports. Camille looked at him. He was stealing data. That's what it looks like. For my company, yes. She stood up. She walked to the window. The city was doing what cities do at midnight, still moving, still lit, indifferent to the things happening 14 floors up in an office where a woman was learning that a man she'd trusted for 6 years had buried something in her walls. The technical complaints, she said without turning around. There were a few 2, maybe 3 times. Different employees mentioned interference issues with their wireless equipment. Darren reviewed it every time, said it was environmental. Said it was within normal variation, because investigating it properly would have found the transmitter. Because investigating it properly would have found the transmitter, she repeated. Quietly, like something settling. She stood at the window for a while. My daughter, she said. He knew the system was affecting her. I don't know if he knew specifically. He knew Rosie came to the facility. He knew I'd installed a hearing loop in the house and that she wore hearing aids. He reviewed the technical setup for the house system personally. Her voice had gone flat in a way that was different from composed. He knew. Tobias didn't argue with that, because she was right. We need to move, she said, before he realizes we've been looking. Before he has time to get the rest of it out. I know. I've already started building the document package for independent engineers and investigators. Technical findings, the records we have, the signal analysis. He paused. But Camille, once this goes to investigators, it moves fast. And Darren is smart enough to know when a situation is closing in. She turned away from the window. What does that mean in practical terms? It means we need to be ready for him to move before we're ready for him to. Can you access the remaining server logs before he gets to them? I need inside access to the secondary server bay. The one in Building C, I can get you in tonight. She was already reaching for her phone. It was 12:15 in the morning, and outside the window the city was still indifferent. And 14 floors up, Camille Arkwright was done waiting for other people to find the problem. She was done within expected parameters. She was done with explanations that explained nothing. She had a name now. She had partial records. She had a man standing in her office who moved through dark corridors with equipment cases and saw ghost frequencies in walls, and had, in a matter of days, done what 4 years of expensive professionals had not looked at the environment around her daughter instead of looking at her daughter. She thought about Rosie pressing her fingers behind her ear at the family event. She thought about 14 months, possibly longer. Tonight, she agreed, and she picked up her bag and her badge and did not look back at the cold takeout containers on the conference table. They went back into the building, and that was when everything stopped being careful. Because when they reached the secondary server bay in Building C, Tobias pulled up the physical access log on the panel beside the door and went still. What? Camille said. He turned the panel so she could read it. The bay had been accessed 40 minutes ago. The badge used was Darren Voss's. He knows, Tobias said, and outside the first hard sleet of October began to hit the windows of Building C like something knocking to be let in, and down the corridor, the lights flickered once a brief, almost polite interruption, and then held. For now, the access log timestamp read 11:34 p.m. Tobias stared at it for 3 seconds, then turned and looked down the corridor in both directions. Empty, institutional lighting, the quiet hum of a building that was mostly asleep. How long ago did you badge in, he said. 6:12, Camille said. The side entrance. And you didn't pass through the main lobby. No. So he doesn't know you're here. She understood what he was doing, running the geometry of it, figuring out what Darren knew and what he didn't, and how much of an advantage that gave them. He came in at 11:30, she said, 40 minutes ago. He accessed this bay. And then what? Could still be in the building, Tobias said. Or he left through an exit that doesn't log automatically. He glanced at the equipment case in his hand, made a decision. We go in, we pull whatever he hasn't erased yet, and we do it fast. And if he's still here, he looked at her directly. Then we find out what he does when he realizes the situation is already past the point where running helps him. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. The server bay door opened on her CEO badge. The room inside was cold and loud rows of rack-mounted servers, indicator lights blinking in patterns that meant nothing to Camille, but that Tobias read with the same quiet attention he gave everything. He went straight to the secondary rack on the eastern wall, the one the partial records had pointed toward, and plugged in a drive before the door had fully swung closed behind them. Talk me through what I'm looking at, Camille said. She stood behind him and watched the screen. This rack handles the overflow traffic from the main server room next door. But there's a partition here. He pointed at a section of the directory tree. This partition isn't in your official network documentation. It's been labeled as a redundancy cache, which is why nobody questioned it. But the file structure is wrong for a cache. A cache doesn't organize data this way. What does organize data this way? A relay staging area, he said. Something that receives data, holds it temporarily, then pushes it out through a secondary channel on a schedule. He pulled up a subdirectory. Look at the timestamps. Files arrive here in batches. Then they disappear. But the deletion logs show the files weren't deleted, internally they were transmitted. Then the record of the transmission was overwritten. To where? Camille said. Where did they go? That's what he was here trying to finish erasing. Tobias opened another window. But he didn't finish. The directory that appeared was mostly empty. But in one corner of it, 17 files sat untouched, a cluster that the deletion sweep had missed, possibly because the sweep had been interrupted, possibly because Darren had heard something, or checked the time, or made some small nervous decision that had broken his concentration for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was enough. Tobias started copying the files. 4 minutes, he said quietly. Maybe 5. Camille stood with her arms crossed and watched the progress bar and listened to the building and thought about Darren Voss sitting in the chair across from her desk for 6 years. She thought about the way he'd always had an answer ready. About the time she'd asked about the interference complaints, and he'd explained them away with the kind of calm, technical confidence she'd always found reassuring. About his face when she'd introduced him to Rosie at a company event 2 years ago, easy, warm, completely normal. She'd been good at reading people her whole adult life. She was supposed to be good at it. It was one of the things she'd built her reputation on. Done, Tobias said. He pulled the drive and powered down the connection point, and then Camille's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Security system notification. A door in the building had opened. East fire exit, she said. Tobias was already moving. That exit goes to the parking structure, he said. Stay here. I'm not staying here. He stopped. He turned. Camille. No, she said flatly. This is my building and that is my data, and whatever he is doing with it has been happening in my walls for over a year while my daughter. She stopped. Steadied herself. I am not staying here. He looked at her for a beat. Then he moved toward the door. Stay behind me, he said, and stay quiet. They came out into the corridor and went toward the east wing at a pace that was fast without being a run, and the sleet outside had intensified. Camille could hear it against the high windows now, a constant irregular percussion against the glass. The building's emergency lighting had kicked on in the east corridor, which meant the main power draw from the storm had tripped something, and the ordinary fluorescent light had gone a shade dimmer and colder. The east fire exit at the end of the corridor had a small window embedded in it. Tobias reached it first and looked through without touching the door. He's in the parking structure, he said. Ground level. Getting into a vehicle. Camille came up beside him and looked. Darren was maybe 40 yards away, moving fast, a laptop bag over one shoulder and a hard drive case in the other hand. He reached a dark SUV parked near the structure's pillar and pulled the door open. He's leaving, she said. He's leaving with whatever he managed to pull before we got here, Tobias said. Let him go. We have what matters. He held up the drive. And we have enough to stop him before he goes anywhere useful. Call it in, she said. Not from here, not from any company system. He may still have monitoring on the network. My personal phone. Yes, right now, outside official channels. Legal and whatever law enforcement contact you have who isn't going to tip a common contact inside the company before morning. Camille was already dialing. Her attorney first, 40 seconds. She talked while they walked back toward the server bay, and her attorney asked 3 questions, and then stopped asking questions, and started moving. Her CFO second, 30 seconds. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding like a man who had learned long ago that calls from Camille at midnight were never nothing. Then she made the 3rd call, the one she made last, because she needed the first 2 to be finished before it, and she gave the federal investigative contact a name and a building and a drive full of partially surviving records and 17 files that a man in a dark parking structure 40 yards away had not had quite enough time to erase. By the time she ended that call, Darren's SUV was gone, and the sleet outside had become something closer to freezing rain. What happened in the next 6 hours was not clean. Camille had learned a long time ago that nothing involving the law and corporate malfeasance ever happened the way it did in films, where things moved with satisfying efficiency and everyone said exactly the right thing at the right moment. What actually happened was a great deal of waiting, a great deal of phone calls that led to other phone calls, two attorneys who arrived at the office at 2 in the morning and spent 45 minutes reviewing documents before anyone used the word investigator, and a corporate security consultant, Camille's attorney, brought in who asked Tobias 11 questions in a row and received 11 specific unhurried answers that seemed to shift the consultant's entire posture. At 3:40 in the morning, Camille's attorney put down his coffee and said, "Where did he learn to do network forensics?" "The Navy," Camille said. The attorney looked at Tobias. "What did you actually do in the Navy?" Tobias was quiet for a moment. "Communication security assessment," he said. Primarily. Finding signals in environments where signals weren't supposed to be. For how long? 7 years. The attorney nodded slowly, wrote something down, and moved it on. He was smart enough to know when not to ask the next question. By 4:30, the framework was in place. Investigators would have access to the facility's systems by morning. The 17 recovered files were already in secure hands. The secondary partition had been flagged and preserved with chain of custody documentation. Darren Voss's access credentials had been suspended, quietly. Without triggering the alert notification he'd have received under a standard HR termination, a detail that Camille's security consultant had thought of and that Tobias had simply nodded at when it was proposed because it was exactly the right call. Camille sat in her office with a coffee that had gone cold, and Tobias sat across from her, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. Outside, the storm had settled into the kind of steady, gray, freezing rain that committed to staying. "You should go home," he said. "Get a few hours. Rosie's with Mrs. Henley until tomorrow afternoon," she said. "There's no reason to rush." She looked down at the cup. "I keep thinking about 14 months. He didn't say anything. I sat in an audiologist's office 14 months ago," she said. "Different one. The 3rd out-of-state specialist. She told me that Rosie's inconsistent responses were just the nature of her condition. That variability was expected, that I needed to adjust my expectations." She paused. I believed her, because what else was I going to do? She had the credentials. She had the data. And She stopped. "I went home and told Rosie that we'd tried something new, and it hadn't changed things, and that was okay. That we just had to keep working with what we had." Tobias was watching her. Rosie said, "Okay," Camille continued. She signed it. Just okay. And then she went back to her homework. She shook her head slightly. She's 8 years old, and she already knows how to handle her mother's disappointment gracefully. She's already learned to make it easy on me. And I sat there at the kitchen table and watched her, read her homework, and thought I've let her down. Whatever I'm doing isn't enough. You hadn't let her down, Tobias said. No? Something was working against her that you didn't know about. That's not the same thing. It feels like the same thing from inside it. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I know how that feels. She looked at him. He seemed to realize he'd said more than he intended. He shifted in his chair. He looked at the window. Molly's mother left when Molly was 2, he said. He said it with the flatness of someone who has stated a fact so many times it has worn smooth. She had her reasons. It's not a simple story. But for a long time after, I kept going back over everything I'd done during those 2 years and trying to figure out what I'd missed, what I should have seen, what I could have fixed if I'd just been paying better attention. Camille said nothing. She waited. Took me a long time to understand that some things weren't mine to fix, she said. And that spending all my time on the inventory of failures was a way of staying in the same place. Staying stuck, instead of actually being present for the one person who needed me to be present. Molly, she said. Molly, he said. How old is she now? 9. She checked out a sign language book from the library on her own last week. Didn't tell me. I found it open in her lap when she fell asleep on the couch. Camille looked at him. Why would she stopped? Because of Rosie. He nodded. She met Rosie for about 40 minutes at that family event, he said. But apparently that was enough. He paused. She's been practicing the alphabet. She made me quiz her last night while she was eating dinner. Camille looked down at her cold coffee for a moment. Rosie would love that, she said quietly. She doesn't make friends as easily as I wish she did. Not because she doesn't want to. Because other kids don't always know what to do with the gap. Molly doesn't know what to do with it either, Tobias said honestly. But she's decided that's a problem she's going to work on, instead of waiting for it to solve itself. Camille almost smiled. That's an unusually sophisticated way for a 9-year-old to think about it. She's an unusually sophisticated 9-year-old, he said. She gets it from. He paused. He seemed to consider where that sentence was going. She works things out on her own. I'm not sure where she gets it from. Camille did smile then, briefly, and it changed her face in a way that she clearly hadn't intended. She caught herself and looked away. You should get some sleep too, she said. You have a shift in the morning. I'll call in.
You don't have to.
I'll call in, he said again, without making a production of it. There are things I still need to walk through with your security consultant before the investigators arrive. And I want to make sure the physical transmitter locations are properly documented before anyone goes into those spaces officially. She studied him. You're very comfortable operating in the middle of a crisis, she said. Occupational conditioning, he said, from the Navy. From the Navy, she nodded. She looked at her phone. She set it down. Tobias, she said, what you said before about finding problems people worked hard to hide. That was the whole job, wasn't it? It wasn't just communication security. He looked at her steadily. I can't talk about most of it, he said. I'm not asking about most of it. I'm asking about you. About what that kind of work does to a person. He was quiet. It teaches you to see, he said finally, things that are out of place. Signals that don't belong. Behaviors that don't match the official story. He paused. And then you come home and you try to stop seeing everything that way. Because if you apply that lens to your whole life, to every person you meet, you stop being able to trust anything. Did you, she said, manage to stop? He looked at her for a long moment. Working on it, he said. The storm made its real move at 7 in the morning. What had been steady freezing rain became something harder and more serious. The temperature dropping fast enough that the rain turned to sleet, and then to driving snow in the space of an hour. And the power in Building C, the research facility, did what the power in older structures does in serious weather. It made a decision. Camille was on a call with her attorney when the lights went. Not all of them. The main grid held. But the secondary power system that handled the east wing of the research facility, the wing that contained the server bays, the communications infrastructure, and the secured research laboratory that several of her engineers had been working overnight to prepare for the investigative team's morning arrival, that system dropped. In a properly functioning building, the backup generators would have taken over in under 30 seconds. In a building whose power infrastructure had been quietly modified by the same man who had modified its wireless network, the backup system did something different. It tried to activate, and then it locked. Camille got the emergency alert on her phone while she was still on the call with her attorney. She looked at the alert. She looked at Tobias across the room. East wing, she said, power failure. Backup system isn't cycling. He was already on his feet. Who's in the east wing, he said. She was already pulling up the overnight access log on her tablet. 4 engineers, her corporate security consultant. And she stopped. She looked at the log again. Rosie's not here, she said, almost to herself. She's with Mrs. Henley. Who's in the secured research wing specifically, he said. His voice had changed, not louder. just different. Cleaner. 2 engineers, Martinez and Choi. They were running a verification sweep on the server partition before the investigators. She stopped. The secured wing has electronic locks. If the backup system locked instead of cycling, the locks fail secure, he said, which means they lock down when the power system faults, which means your engineers are inside a sealed room. She was already moving. He moved faster. This was the thing that nobody in her company, none of the people who had worked alongside Tobias for 3 years of third rotation maintenance shifts had ever had reason to see. He moved through the building's darkened east wing corridors with a directness that had nothing to do with familiarity with the layout, though he clearly had that too. It was something underneath the familiarity, a physical calm that didn't come from not understanding the situation. It came from understanding it completely, including the worst parts of it, and having already accepted the full cost of that understanding before taking the first step. Camille ran to keep pace with him and watched him process the environment the way she had seen him, process the server room systematically, without wasted motion, and she understood for the first time that the utility vest and the maintenance badge and the third rotation shift had never been the whole story. They had been a cover that fit comfortably enough that she'd never thought to look under it. The emergency lighting in the east corridor was running on a separate battery system, which gave them enough to see by not well, but enough. Tobias pulled a small flashlight from the vest and added to it, and the beam was steadier than the battery lighting and moved exactly where he needed it to move. They reached the first electronic lock at the secured wing entrance. Tobias looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. He crouched down and opened the access panel below the keypad with a flathead from the vest pocket. Inside was the manual override interface, a system designed for authorized maintenance personnel that most of the company's employees didn't know existed. He looked at the wiring for a moment, then reached past the standard connections to a secondary bus that ran beneath them. "This is going to take a minute," he said. "The engineers. The room has its own air supply for exactly this scenario. They're not in danger from the sealed space. But the temperature is going to drop fast in there, and if anyone panics and tries to force the mechanisms..." "Martinez panics," Camille said immediately. "He's a brilliant engineer and he panics." "Call him," Tobias said. "Tell him specifically not to touch the locking mechanism." "Tell him exactly that." She had Martinez on the phone in 15 seconds. She used her CEO voice, which was different from her regular voice, in a way she'd never fully articulated, but that Martinez clearly registered, because he said "yes, ma'am" in the tone of someone sitting very still. Tobias worked the manual override. It wasn't designed to be fast, it was designed to require deliberate, knowledgeable engagement specifically, so it couldn't be bypassed accidentally. He moved through the sequence without referring to anything, which told Camille that he had looked at this building's schematics at some point well before tonight and had committed the relevant sections to a kind of memory that she was beginning to understand was different from ordinary retention. The lock released, not gracefully. It took 2 tries and a brief moment where nothing happened that made Camille's stomach drop, and then it opened with a mechanical thud. Martinez was standing on the other side, phone still pressed to his ear. He was pale. He was trying very hard not to show how pale he was.
"We're clear?"
Tobias said. "Clear," Choi said from behind Martinez. She was calmer than her colleague, pragmatic, and she was already pulling her equipment bag. "Get to the main corridor," Tobias said. "Stay away from the east wing until the power situation is stabilized." Martinez nodded and moved. Choi nodded and followed, and Tobias was already moving past them toward the secondary server bay. "What are you doing?" Camille said. "The partition." He stopped, changed direction, looked at the emergency lighting, calculated something. If the power fault triggered a reset cycle on the secondary rack, the file preservation we set up last night might have. "Tobias." He looked at her. "The investigators are coming in 3 hours," she said. "Whatever is at risk in that server bay, it's already been submitted. We have the drive, we have the files, we have the log records from the attorney's secure system. If something in that room resets, it doesn't change what we already have." He held her gaze. "You're right," he said, after a beat. "I know," she said. "Let's get out of this corridor." They found Darren Voss 26 minutes later. Not in the parking structure. Not fleeing the city on a pre-dawn flight, which was what Camille had assumed he'd be doing. They found him in the main lobby of the research facility, sitting in one of the low chairs near the reception desk with his laptop bag on the floor beside him and his hard drive case in his lap, and the look of a man who had made it all the way to the door and then run the math one final time and understood that the math no longer worked. He looked up when Camille came in. She stopped 8 feet away. Tobias stopped beside her, slightly back, and said nothing. Darren looked at them both. He looked at the equipment case in Tobias's hand. He looked at Camille's face. "You have the partition files," he said. His voice was flat, not a question. "We have 17 files from the staging partition, the transmission logs surrounding the deletion gaps, the signal analysis from both properties, the configuration codes that trace to your user account, and a formal documentation package that's been in my attorney's hands since 2 o'clock this morning," Camille said. Darren closed his eyes briefly. "How long?" she said. He opened them again. "Does that matter? To me it does." He looked at the floor. 22 months, he said. She did the arithmetic fast, and she felt it land in her chest like something dropped from a height. 22 months. Not 14, not the 14 that the surviving logs had suggested. 22 months during which daughter had been spending time in properties that were broadcasting interference into the frequency bands of her hearing equipment. During which the speech therapist's notes about Rosie's inconsistency at home had piled up. During which Camille had sat in waiting rooms and specialist offices and absorbed the words variability and expected parameters and gone home and told her 8-year-old daughter to keep working with what they had. "Darren," she said, and she kept her voice even with the effort of someone lifting something heavy. "Did you know what it was doing to Rosie's equipment?" He didn't answer immediately. "I knew there was interference," he said finally. "I didn't know. I didn't do a specific analysis of how it affected." "But you knew," she said, "when the complaints came in. When I asked you, you knew there was something interfering with wireless equipment in those spaces." His jaw tightened. "Yes," he said. The word sat between them. "She's 8 years old," Camille said. Darren looked at the floor. "I know," he said. He said it quietly, without excuse, in the way of someone who has known something uncomfortable for a long time and has worked very hard not to look at it directly. "Who were you relaying data to?" she said. He stopped. "That's a conversation I'll have with an attorney." "It will be," she said, "and with investigators. And they're going to be here in about 2.5 hours. So I'd suggest you use the time between now and then to decide whether the version of this story you tell first is the version that gives you any room to work with." She turned away from him. She had said what she came to say. Anything beyond it was for other people and other conversations. Tobias fell into step beside her. They walked back toward the east corridor, and behind them she heard Darren's laptop bag scrape the floor as he shifted in the chair. And then the lobby went quiet, except for the sound of the storm, still battering the building's upper windows, which had not let up. "You didn't yell at him," Tobias said when they were far enough away. "No. Why not?" She thought about it. "Because yelling at him would have been for me," she said. "And I need to be very clear right now about what is for me and what is for Rosie." He said nothing, but he nodded once. The investigators arrived at 9:17, not 3 hours after Camille's call, but 2.5, which was faster than anyone had predicted in the middle of an ice storm. They were competent and they were thorough, and they had questions that Tobias answered with the same unhurried specificity he'd brought to everything else. And at several points, the lead investigator looked at him the way Camille's attorney had looked at him, with an expression that said she was revising her initial assessment significantly upward. Darren Voss gave a voluntary statement that lasted 4 hours. The data relay, as it turned out, was corporate espionage, a scheme to extract proprietary research data on a technology platform that Camille's company had been developing for 3 years and was 18 months from bringing to market. Darren had been approached through a third party. He had been well compensated. He had told himself at the beginning that it was a victimless transaction, and by the time the situation had grown complex enough to require a transmitter in the walls and the burial of technical complaints, and the deliberate ignorance of what the frequency interference was doing to a small girl's hearing equipment, he had told himself that too many steps had been taken to reverse course. The investigators were familiar with that particular moral trajectory. Camille sat in her office at noon, after the statements and the documentation and the 3 consecutive conversations with her legal team, and stared at the window for a while. The storm had finally begun to ease. The sleet had thinned. Through the streaked glass, the city was visible again, wet and gray, and going about its business. Tobias knocked on the open door. "Investigators are done with me," he said. "I can go." She turned. "The transmitters," she said. "In the house and the facility. They'll be removed?" "Today. The investigative team has a technical unit. They'll document them in place first and then pull them." He paused. "After that, your building system goes back to operating the way it was designed to. The interference goes with the transmitters." She nodded. And then she said slowly, "We take Rosie's equipment to an audiologist." "An independent one," he said, "not affiliated with any previous assessment. Fresh calibration, clean environment, proper baseline." "Yes." She looked at him. He was standing in her doorway in the same utility vest he'd been in for the last 18 hours, with the equipment case at his feet and 12 hours of no sleep behind his eyes, and he looked tired. Human. Like a man who had run a very long distance and had not fully reckoned with how far it was until it was over. "Tobias," she said. "Yeah, I know you said you don't want money. But what you did," she stopped. "What you did for my daughter. Over the past 2 weeks. The hours, the risk. I didn't do it for money," he said. "I know," she paused. "That's what I'm trying to say." "I know, and that's," she shook her head, "that's something I don't know what to do with. I'm not accustomed to it." He picked up the equipment case. "You'll figure it out," he said. "You're good at figuring things out. My specialists would disagree. Your specialists weren't looking at the right thing." She almost smiled. He moved to go. "Tobias," he stopped. "Thank you," she said, just that. Not the full weight of what she meant, because she didn't have the words for the full weight yet, and wasn't sure she'd find them today. He looked at her for a moment. "Let me know what the audiologist says," he said. Then he walked out, and his footsteps went down the hallway and were gone, and Camille turned back to the window and the wet city beyond it, and the slow, unfamiliar feeling of standing at the edge of something that had not yet revealed its full shape. Outside, the storm had almost stopped. The last of the sleet came down thin and scattered, like something that had run out of conviction, and then the clouds shifted, and a pale, cold October light came through. And for the first time in 22 months, Camille Arkwright's building sat quiet in its own frequencies, broadcasting nothing that didn't belong. The appointment was scheduled for 11 in the morning, 12 days after the investigators finished with the building. 12 days because Camille had spent the first 3 managing the immediate fallout, the internal communications, the board notification, the carefully worded public statement that her legal team had drafted and redrafted until it said exactly what needed to be said and nothing that didn't. She had spent the next 4 days in back-to-back meetings, restructuring the technology division, bringing in an interim director with no ties to Darren's tenure, and commissioning the independent security review she should have mandated years ago. She had spent 2 days flying to meet with the European partners, who needed to hear from her directly that the data breach had been contained and that the platform timeline was intact. Then she had come home, and she had sat in Rosie's room on the edge of the bed with the dream catcher in the window and the too many pillows, and said to her daughter, who was reading a chapter book with that slightly tilted intensity, "I need to tell you some things." Rosie had put the book down and looked at her mother with the particular alertness she used when she understood that what was coming mattered. Camille had told her as much of the truth as an 8-year-old needed to hear. That there had been something wrong in their house and at the facility, something electronic, that had been working against her hearing equipment without anyone knowing. That it had been fixed now. That they were going to go see a new audiologist and try some things again. Rosie had listened to all of it, with her eyes tracking her mother's face. Then she signed, "Is that why it was so loud sometimes? The hurting kind of loud?" Camille went very still. "Tell me about the hurting kind of loud," she said. Rosie signed slowly, searching for the right description. Not sound. More like pressure. Behind here. She pressed 2 fingers behind her right ear, the same gesture Tobias had noticed at the family event. It happened more at home than other places. I thought it was normal. Camille had prepared herself for this conversation. She had rehearsed it in the car on the way home from the last board meeting. She had been very sure she was ready for it. She was not ready for it. She held her face very steady and said it wasn't normal. And it's not going to happen anymore. I'm going to make sure. Rosie studied her for a moment. Then she signed. "Okay. Is Molly coming to the doctor? Camille blinked. You want Molly there? She's been practicing her signs. She'd want to come. Camille thought of Tobias telling her about the library book open in his daughter's lap. She thought of a 9-year-old who had decided on her own that a gap was a problem to work on. I'll ask her dad, she said. The audiology clinic was not the kind of place Camille usually brought Rosie. It was a pediatric specialty practice that one of the investigators had mentioned, obliquely, during a break in the formal sessions, not as a referral, just as a name that had come up in a related context. Camille had looked it up, called in a favor with a colleague in the medical field who knew the clinic's lead audiologist personally, and had the appointment within a week. Dr. Anita Soren was 53, had short gray-streaked hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head as a permanent fixture, and had the manner of someone who had spent decades listening to children in every sense of the word. She had reviewed Rosie's full file before the appointment. Camille had sent everything, not just the medical records, but Tobias's technical analysis and the interference documentation, which Dr. Soren had apparently read carefully enough to have specific questions about. She had those questions ready when they arrived. Camille came in with Rosie. Tobias came in behind them with Molly, who was wearing a slightly too big jacket and had clearly spent some time that morning practicing a specific sign she wanted to use, because she deployed it the moment she saw Rosie, a careful, slightly imperfect rendering of hello. I'm happy to see you, and Rosie's face did something that Camille had not seen it do in a long time. Complete, uncomplicated delight. Rosie signed back fast enough that Molly had to catch her father's sleeve and say, "What did she say?" And Tobias translated. "She says your hand shape is a little off, but it's really good for 2 weeks." And Molly said, "Only 2 weeks. I'll be better than you in a month." And Rosie laughed, which was a sound she made rarely and which stopped everyone in the waiting room briefly and involuntarily. Dr. Soren appeared in the doorway of the testing area and took in the scene. "All right," she said. "Let's start with the easy stuff and see where we get." The first part of the assessment was standard, the same booths and tones and response protocols that Rosie had been through 15 times before. She went in with Dr. Soren and a specialist technician, while Camille sat in the observation area with a window into the testing environment. Tobias sat beside her. Molly sat on his other side with the sign language book she had apparently brought in her backpack. Camille watched Rosie through the window. She had watched Rosie in testing booths many times. She knew the particular way her daughter sat in the chair upright, focused, a little formal about it, like she was trying to get it right. She knew the slight movement of Rosie's hands when she was waiting, a habit of quietly signing to herself that Rosie was probably not aware she did. "She's not nervous," Tobias said quietly. "She's a veteran of these things," Camille said. "She stopped getting nervous around the 6th or 7th time. Does she understand today is different?" Camille watched Rosie adjust the position of the headset with a patience that was very old for 8 years. "I didn't want to tell her it might be different," she said. "Because if it isn't, if we get in there and the interference is gone and the recalibration is done and her responses are still the same, then her baseline is her baseline," Tobias said. "And that's real information too." "I know. Knowing the actual baseline is better than not knowing," he said. "Whatever it is, I know." She paused. "I do know that. She stopped. "You want it to be different," he said. "Every single day for 5 years," she said, "I have wanted something to be different. And I've gotten pretty good at managing the distance between wanting and having. But today," she shook her head slightly, "today that distance is very short." "And that's," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the word." He didn't offer anything reassuring. She appreciated that more than she could say. She had had 5 years of people offering her reassuring things. Across the room, Molly had stopped reading and was watching Rosie through the window too, the book open but forgotten in her lap. "She's going to be okay," Molly said, not to anyone in particular. Just out loud into the room. Tobias looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I know she is," Molly said, with the complete certainty of a child who has decided something and sees no reason to revisit it. "I just thought somebody should say it." The testing took 90 minutes. Camille had been through enough of these assessments to know that 90 minutes was on the longer side, which could mean very little or could mean that doctor. Soren was being thorough in a way that suggested she was finding things worth being thorough about. She sat with that ambiguity for 90 minutes and did not check her phone except once, and the one time she checked it, she read nothing and put it back in her pocket. Tobias got them both coffee from the waiting room machine at the 45-minute mark. It was bad coffee, the kind that tasted like the cup it came in, and he brought it over without comment, and she took it without comment, and they sat with it. "Tell me about Molly's mother," Camille said, at around the 60-minute mark. She wasn't sure why she said it then. The question had been sitting in her somewhere for a while, and the particular quality of the waiting made it come loose. He was quiet for a moment. "Her name was Dara," he said. It wasn't a slow thing that fell apart. It was fast. One of those situations where two people who work in high-pressure environments try to build something in the margins between those environments and eventually realize that what they've built is thin. There's not enough of it. He looked at the coffee cup. She's in Portland now. She and Rosie, he caught himself. She and Molly talk on the phone. It's not simple, but it's not nothing. Camille noted the slip, filed it away without comment. "Do you miss it?" she said. "The life before?" "Which part?" "Any of it." He considered it genuinely, which she had come to understand was something he did. He did not reach for quick answers. "I miss being good at something in a way that was clear," he said. When you're doing that kind of work, you know every day exactly what success looks like and exactly how far away you are from it. That clarity, he paused. Raising a kid, you don't get that. You don't know if you're doing it right for years. Maybe ever. You're making calls based on incomplete information, and you can't run a post-operation assessment to find out what you missed. "No," Camille agreed. "You can't. I used to find that unbearable. The uncertainty of it. And now?" He looked at Molly, who had fallen asleep sideways in her chair, with the sign language book still open on her chest, one finger marking a page. "Now I think the uncertainty is the job," he said. "You just show up every day and make the best call you can with what you have. And sometimes you get it wrong, and you try to do better." Camille looked at Molly, too. "She's remarkable," she said. "She's a lot of work," he said immediately, with the frankness of someone who loves something deeply and has no patience for sanitizing it. "She argues about everything. She has opinions about dinner that I did not ask for. She stayed up until midnight last Tuesday because she decided she needed to finish a book, and when I told her lights out, she said," he paused, seemed to be deciding whether to reproduce it. "She said, 'Dad, the character is in crisis, and I have to know if she's okay,' and I genuinely did not have a counter-argument." Camille laughed. Quietly but genuinely. "Rosie does the same thing," she said. "She signs in her sleep sometimes. I'll look in on her and her hands are moving." "What does she sign?" "I don't know. I can't always make it out. Mrs. Henley says she thinks Rosie is telling herself stories." Tobias smiled. Not a polished smile, the real kind. The door to the testing area opened. Both of them were on their feet before they'd consciously decided to stand. Dr. Soren came out first. Rosie was behind her, holding the specialist technician's hand and looking at her mother with an expression that Camille read in less than a second, not upset, not confused, something more like waiting. Keyed up. The way you look when something has happened and you don't have the words for it yet, and you need someone else to say it first. "Let's all sit down," Dr. Soren said. The clinical explanation took 18 minutes. Dr. Soren used a tablet with visual aids, which she angled toward Rosie as much as toward the adults, because she was the kind of practitioner who addressed the patient and not just the parents, and Camille noted this and felt a complicated gratitude for it. The picture that emerged was this: Rosie's underlying hearing profile was real, and it was significant, and it was not changed by removing the interference. She had bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, and she would have it for the rest of her life. And the technology she used would be a permanent and important part of how she moved through the world. But the interference had been doing something measurable and verifiable to that technology. The hearing aids Rosie used operated in a frequency range that the transmitter's broadcast pattern had directly disrupted, causing what Dr. Soren described as dynamic signal degradation, not a constant flat reduction in performance, but a fluctuating interference that made the devices inconsistent in exactly the way Rosie's records had shown for 22 months. The hearing loop system in the house had compounded this, acting as an additional antenna for the interference, rather than a supplement to the aid's function. With properly functioning equipment in a clean electromagnetic environment, Dr. Soren said, Rosie's aided response profile looks different from what her previous assessments showed. She paused. Meaningfully different. Camille looked at her. How meaningfully, she said. The frequency ranges where she was consistently showing minimal response, the mid to upper ranges where speech intelligibility lives, she's showing access today that wasn't present in any of her previous clinic assessments. Doctor. Soren set the tablet down. I want to be careful here. I'm not going to tell you that her equipment is going to transform her experience overnight. She has genuine significant hearing loss, and she's spent years building communication strategies around a degraded signal. Some of what we see today will hold up with proper equipment and a clean environment. Some of it will need time and professional support to develop into functional hearing. This isn't a reversal. It's a correction, getting back to what the equipment was always supposed to be able to give her. Camille sat very still. But there's a difference, she said. There's a real, measurable, clinically significant difference, doctor. Soren said, yes. The room was quiet. Rosie was watching her mother's face. Can we try something? Dr. Soren said. She looked at Rosie. We recalibrated your devices during the testing session. I'd like to do one more thing with your mom, if that's okay. Rosie looked at Camille. Then she nodded. Dr. Soren had Camille move to a position about 6 feet in front of Rosie. The room was quiet, the specific managed quiet of an audiology clinic, acoustically controlled, clean. I'd like you to say Rosie's name, Dr. Soren said. Normally, the way you'd say it at home. Camille looked at her daughter. She had said her daughter's name 10,000 times. She had said it in frustration and in tenderness and in the darkness of the early morning when she was checking that Rosie was breathing and in the car and across the dinner table and in hospital waiting rooms and at bedtime and in dreams. She knew the specific shape of it in her mouth. She said it now. Rosie. Her daughter's head turned. Not a dramatic sweeping movement. Just turned. The small natural reflexive turn of someone who has heard their name called. Camille stopped breathing. Dr. Soren said quietly, again. Rosie, Camille said. Her daughter's eyes found her face. Rosie's expression was strange, not surprised exactly. More like someone who is experiencing something they have felt the edge of before, but never this clearly, trying to decide if they are understanding it correctly. Then Rosie raised her hand and signed, very carefully I heard that. Camille's hand went to her mouth. She had prepared herself for this moment being nothing. She had been preparing herself for nothing for 5 years, with the skill of someone who has practiced disappointment until they're fluent in it. She was not prepared for this. Dr. Soren reached over and put a hand briefly on Camille's arm. Just for a second. A grounding touch. Rosie got up from her chair and crossed the 6 feet between them and put her hands on her mother's face the way she did sometimes when she was reading an expression she needed to be close to. She looked at Camille carefully. Then she signed against her mother's cheek. Don't cry yet. We didn't do the other part. Camille laughed through whatever her face was doing. It came out wrong and completely right. What other part? She managed. Rosie turned. She looked at the doorway. Molly, she said. Out loud. Not a sign. Her voice, which she used rarely and self-consciously, the voice that her speech therapist worked with her on, and that she trusted in very few circumstances. In the doorway, Molly had woken up probably when the testing room door opened, probably had been standing there for the last several minutes, without anyone noticing. She was holding the sign language book against her chest with both arms, and her face was doing something complicated and very young. Hi, Molly said. Rosie signed, hi, your J is still wrong. Tobias translated. Molly said, then teach me, and her voice cracked a little on the last word, in the way of someone who is 9 years old, and not yet practiced at keeping things from showing. Rosie looked at Tobias. She signed something. He translated. She says you're lucky she's available. Molly wiped her face with the back of her hand inelegantly and said, yeah, I know I am. They went to lunch afterward. Not a planned thing. Dr. Soren had given them referrals a specialist for the recalibration follow-up, a pediatric hearing support program, a name in the deaf and hard of hearing community who ran social groups for children Rosie's age. She had given them a folder and a follow-up appointment and the direct number for a question line, and she had shaken Camille's hand at the end and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake and said, she's going to be all right, and Camille had nodded because she didn't trust her voice. And then they were on the sidewalk outside the clinic in the mid-October cold. the four of them, and Rosie was holding Molly's hand and showing her the correct hand shape for the letter J with her free hand, and Molly was copying it with her tongue, pressed between her teeth in concentration, and Tobias was watching his daughter with his hands in his pockets and an expression Camille hadn't seen on him before. Unguarded. Just quietly happy, the specific happiness of a parent watching a child be generous. Lunch, Camille said. He looked at her. I don't know this area, she admitted. I never come to this part of the city. Do you know somewhere that's not too loud? He looked at the girls. Rosie's call. Camille looked at her daughter. Rosie was still correcting Molly's letter J. She glanced up at her mother, caught the question in her face, and signed, the place with the yellow chairs. I don't know the place with the yellow chairs, Camille said. Rosie pointed down the block and signed, I can see it from here. It was a diner. The chairs were yellow. It was the kind of place that had been in the same spot for 30 years and had no reason to apologize for it. Vinyl booths, handwritten specials on a chalkboard, coffee that came in mugs, so large they were technically bowls. They got a corner booth, the girls on one side and the adults on the other, and Rosie immediately spread both hands on the table and demonstrated a complete alphabet sequence for Molly, who copied each letter with increasing confidence and decreasing tongue tip involvement. Tobias ordered coffee. Camille ordered coffee. They both ordered food they didn't particularly eat because the conversation was better than the food, which was how it usually went in places like this. She said Mossy, Camille said, out loud. She hasn't used her voice that way, for she thought about it. She went through a period around 6 where she stopped. Her speech therapist said it was common kids learn that signing is more reliable than the voice they're not sure anyone can understand, so they default to what works. And I never pushed it because it was hers. Her voice is hers. And today she used it, Tobias said. She chose to, Camille said. That's different from being prompted to. He nodded. What did Dr. Soren say about how long it will take? He asked. For the equipment improvement to translate into something functional, Camille said. She didn't give me a timeline because it depends on too many things. Rosie's brain has been compensating for a degraded signal for 22 months. Some of what the equipment can now give her, her auditory processing, will need time to learn to use. It's not you don't just flip a switch, she paused. But she said the fundamentals are there. The capacity is real. It was being blocked. It was being blocked, he said, by someone who was looking after his own interests and couldn't be bothered to follow the thread of what that cost. Her voice was steady. She'd done the anger in private, in the 3 days after the investigation, and she had done it properly, the way you would do grief when you let yourself actually feel it instead of managing it. She'd cried twice, once in the shower, once in her car in a parking garage at midnight, and she'd called her sister in Atlanta, which she almost never did, and she'd sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes. Then she'd gotten up, because there was a great deal left to do. The hearing loop in the house is coming out, she said. Dr. Soren says it's the wrong technology for Rosie's current profile anyway, and in the context of what happened, I want it gone. We're redoing the whole system. Independent audit, clean installation, properly documented specs, nothing touching the walls that isn't verified by someone outside the company. That'll take a few weeks, he said. 6 weeks minimum, she said. In the meantime, Rosie will come with me to the facility where the environment is now clean, or will work from the home office which is in a part of the house that had lower interference readings to begin with. She paused. I'm also moving. Not immediately. But I've been thinking about it for a while anyway. The mansion is too large and too impersonal for what I actually need. I want something that was built for living in, not for impressing people. He looked at her. That's a big change. I'm in the mood for big changes, she said. Across the booth, Rosie had taught Molly the complete alphabet and was now moving on to simple words, which Molly was approaching with the kind of systematic determination that made Tobias quietly proud in the way that parents are proud of things they didn't teach their children. She's picking it up fast, Camille said. She went through a phase where she learned the periodic table for fun, he said. She made me test her every night for a week. Why the periodic table? I have no idea. She said someone told her it was hard and she wanted to see. Camille looked at Molly, then at Rosie. They're good for each other, she said. Yeah, he said, they are. There was a pause. A comfortable one. The kind of pause that, in a different context, between different people, would have been unremarkable. Between the two of them, after the weeks they had just been through, it was something. Tobias looked at his coffee. "I put in my notice," he said. She looked at him, to the facility. When? 2 days ago. Before, he gestured vaguely at the day that had just happened. It was overdue regardless. "I've been at that job for 3 years, and I was always aware it was a stopgap. A way to stay in one place long enough for Molly to have some stability." He paused. "She has stability now. She's got friends at school. She knows her neighborhood. I don't need to anchor myself there anymore." "What will you do?" Camille said. He looked at her evenly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I've had a few conversations with people I used to know. There's some contract security assessment work available that might—" He stopped. "It's early." She said nothing for a moment. She looked at the girls across the booth, Rosie demonstrating a word, Molly attempting it, both of them giggling at something that had gone sideways in the translation. "I have a board meeting next week," Camille said, "where I'm presenting the restructuring plan for the technology division. Part of that plan involves what we do going forward to make sure something like this never happens again." She paused. "I've been thinking about something bigger than that." "Bigger how?" he said. "Bigger in the sense of—" She chose the words carefully. "In the sense of what we were supposed to be building before someone decided our infrastructure was a commodity he could sell. We had a technology platform in development. It's still viable. But I've been sitting with something since Rosie's diagnosis, for years, about the gap between what the technology sector thinks assistive technology looks like and what people who actually depend on it need." She looked at him. "Not just hearing. Across the full spectrum. The gap between what the engineers design and what actually works in the real environments of real people's lives." He was watching her closely. "You're thinking about an accessibility division," he said. "I'm thinking about something that hasn't existed before," she said, "which is a program that puts technical engineers in direct, sustained contact with the people who use the technology, not to do a focus group, not to check a compliance box. To actually build the field testing and the verification and the problem finding into the structure of how things get made." She paused. "You find problems people work very hard to hide," she said. "I'd like to build something that makes hiding problems impossible. Not just in my company." In the field he was quiet. "That's a large thing to build," he said. "I build large things," she said. "It's what I do." Across the table, Rosie was now teaching Molly the sign for friend, which Molly produced with careful precision, and then added on her own initiative the sign for best friend, which she'd apparently looked up on her own, because it hadn't been in the lesson, and Rosie looked at it and looked at Molly's face and signed back the same thing. Tobias watched his daughter's face. Then he looked at Camille. "Tell me more about what you're thinking," he said. She leaned forward slightly, and she did. They stayed in that diner booth for 2 hours. The girls finished signing lessons and moved on to drawing on the paper placemats with the crayons the server had produced unprompted, doing the thing that children do when they have decided they are friends, creating a shared world on available surfaces, not explaining it to anyone, entirely absorbed. Camille and Tobias talked, not about the investigation, which was in hands that didn't need theirs now. Not about Darren, who had become a legal matter and not a personal one, which was where she needed him to be in her head. They talked about the division she was imagining, and what it would need structurally, and how you built something that was supposed to find real-world problems, without immediately becoming the kind of institution that loses its ability to see real-world problems. Tobias talked in a way he didn't normally talk. Specific. Operational. He knew things about building verification systems and field testing protocols that were not in any standard business curriculum, and he explained them without jargon when she asked him to, and asked questions back that were better than most of the questions her board asked her. At some point, the server refilled their coffee for the 3rd time without being asked, and Tobias looked at the time and said, "It's 3:30, and Camille looked at her phone and discovered that 11 work messages had arrived since noon, and she felt briefly guilty, and then decided that the guilt could wait until tomorrow. "Tobias," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to think about something," she said. "Not right now. Not today. But I want you to think about what it would mean to be involved in building this. Not the board work. Not the corporate structure, the field side of it. the part that actually goes into the environments and finds what's wrong. He was quiet. That's a job offer, he said. It's the beginning of a conversation about a potential job offer, she said precisely. I'm not proposing terms. I'm asking if you're willing to consider that a conversation like that could happen. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm willing to consider it, he said. Good, she said. She picked up the check when it came. He moved to take it, and she had already put her card on the table, and he looked at her and she said, You're unemployed. And he said, I have savings. And she said, So do I. It's considerably more, and that was the end of that argument. Outside on the sidewalk, the October afternoon had gone golden and cold, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they've been arranged. Rosie and Molly walked ahead, still signing to each other, Molly making mistakes that Rosie corrected with the patience of someone who has spent years knowing how to meet people where they are. Camille walked beside Tobias and thought about what had happened between the family event in early October and this afternoon, and the distance between those 2 points felt simultaneously enormous and very short, the way time does when the thing that changes everything happens gradually, and then all at once. I keep thinking about what you said, she told him, about staying stuck in the inventory of failures. He said. I've been carrying that inventory for 5 years, she said. Every specialist I chose, every decision I made about her care. Every time I pushed too hard or not hard enough. She watched Rosie demonstrate something to Molly up ahead, a sign, a movement of the hands. I don't want to put it down because it feels like putting it down means I didn't take it seriously. But I can't, she paused. I can't build what I want to build and carry it at the same time. He was quiet for a few steps. The inventory never goes away, he said. You just stop reading it every day. How do you do that? He glanced ahead at Molly. You find something that matters more than the looking back, he said. Something that needs your attention now. She thought about that. Up ahead, Rosie had stopped on the sidewalk and turned around to look back at her mother, and she signed across the 20 feet between them, Are you coming? Camille raised her hand and signed back, Yes, I'm coming. She was not fluent. Her sign was imperfect and slightly slow. But her daughter understood it, and she turned back and took Molly's arm and kept walking. And Camille watched her go and felt the inventory of failures shift slightly, not gone, not even smaller, just held differently. Like something you set down for a minute to see if your hands still work without it. They did. She put one foot in front of the other on the cold October sidewalk, beside a man she had met 3 weeks ago who had crouched by a speaker and noticed what 4 years of professionals had not. And she walked toward her daughter in the afternoon light, and the day closed quietly around all 4 of them like a door, finding its frame after a long time standing open. The accessibility division took 14 months to build correctly, which was 11 months longer than Camille's original timeline, and 3 months shorter than her board's most pessimistic projection, which she considered a reasonable outcome for something that had never quite existed before. She had learned, over 2 decades of building things, that the gap between what you imagine and what you actually construct is where most of the real work happens. The imagining is easy. The imagining feels like progress because it has momentum and shape and the clean logic of something that hasn't yet met reality. The building is where you find out what you actually meant, what you were willing to fight for, and what you were willing to revise. The division was called the Field Reality Program, a name that Tobias had suggested in the 3rd week of planning meetings with the bluntness of someone who had never developed patience for institutional language. Camille had wanted something that sounded more formally significant. He had said, with characteristic directness, You're building something that goes into real environments and finds out what's actually happening versus what the engineers assumed would happen. Call it what it is. She had looked at the whiteboard where 3 other name options were written and erased them. The Field Reality Program. It did exactly what the name said. The structure was unlike anything her company had attempted before. Engineers were paired with end users, not in controlled focus groups, not in lab simulations, but in sustained months-long field relationships where the user's actual daily environment became the test site. Audiologists and deaf and hard-of-hearing consultants sat in the same rooms as the technical teams, not as sign-off reviewers at the end of the process, but as core members of it from the first day of design. Parents brought children. Adults brought their workplaces. The program paid people for their time and their expertise, which was Camille's insistence from the beginning. because she had spent enough years watching companies extract lived experience from people with disabilities as a kind of emotional donation, and she was not building that. Tobias ran the field operations and the technical verification side, which meant he spent a significant amount of time in environments that were not an office schools, hospitals, private homes, manufacturing floors, transit systems with equipment, and a team of 3 field technicians who had been hired specifically for their ability to move between technical and human fluency. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things they were made for without knowing it, and the field teams he built had a culture of specificity and directness that was recognizably his. He was also, for the first time in 3 years, doing work that felt like a full use of who he was. He had not expected that. He had expected the work to be interesting and purposeful, which it was. He had not expected to feel, at the end of a day in the field, the particular satisfaction of someone who has been operating at partial capacity for a long time and has been handed back the parts that were missing. He told Camille this one evening in her new house smaller than the mansion, a mid-century place with good bones and bad original wallpaper that Rosie had helped peel off with aggressive enthusiasm while they were eating dinner at a kitchen table that was the right size for what the family actually was. "You said partial capacity," she said. "What was the other part?" He thought about it. "Molly," he said. Molly was always the other part. But the two things were in separate compartments. The work was the work, and home was home, and I wasn't letting them inform each other. He paused. "Now they do, and that's better." Rosie, across the table, was watching his mouth and face with her usual quiet attention. She had been doing that since she was small, reading the conversation, even when it wasn't directed at her, following the current of it the way some children follow music. She signed, "Better for you or better for Molly?" "Both," he said. Out loud and in sign simultaneously, which he had been practicing for 8 months with the kind of patient, error-tolerant commitment he brought to every skill he decided to acquire. His sign was still imperfect. His J was wrong, which Rosie had informed him of multiple times. But he was present in both languages at once, which was what mattered at this table. Rosie considered his answer and apparently found it acceptable, because she returned to her food. Molly, beside her, was doing homework with one hand and eating with the other, which was a violation of 2 separate household rules that both adults had decided to not notice tonight. Darren Voss's case moved through the legal system the way these things do slowly, and with the particular grinding quality of proceedings that involve corporate espionage, multiple jurisdictions, and a defendant who spent the first 4 months insisting his attorneys could find an angle, and the last 8 accepting that there wasn't one. He pled to federal charges. The sentencing was not light. The company he had been relaying data to a competitor operating through a shell structure that the investigators unspooled over 6 months faced its own separate proceedings. Camille attended the first day of Darren's hearing and no other days. She had said what she needed to say in her victim impact statement, which she had written herself, at 2 a.m. in 3 drafts, the final one being the shortest and the most direct and containing the sentence, "He knew a child was being harmed by what he had installed, and he made the calculation that this was an acceptable cost." She did not forgive him in the statement, because she was not ready to, and she did not pretend otherwise, and she did not withhold the acknowledgement that somewhere before the calculation there had been a man she'd trusted and who had done competent work, and that the distance between those 2 facts was something she would probably be turning over for years. She walked out of the courthouse into a gray February morning and called Tobias. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" he said. She stood on the courthouse steps and watched a pigeon navigate a wind gust with more optimism than aerodynamics. "Like I want to go home," she said. "Then come home," he said. She did. The question of what Rosie's hearing would look like over time was one that Dr. Soren had been honest about from the beginning. It would not be a straight line upward, and anyone who told them otherwise was selling something. There would be good periods and harder ones. There would be calibrations that worked beautifully for 3 months and then needed revisiting. There would be environments that remained difficult regardless of equipment quality, because that was the nature of significant sensorineural hearing loss in a world built for people who heard at full capacity. What changed was that the baseline was real now. The equipment, in a clean electromagnetic environment, properly calibrated, was giving Rosie what it was designed to give her. That was not a miracle, It was a correction. The distinction mattered to Camille, to Dr. Soren, and most importantly to Rosie, who had grown up inside a framework of medical expectations and learned at 8 years old to adjust her understanding of herself accordingly. The adjustment now went in a different direction. She was 9 when she stood up in front of her class at school and gave a presentation about hearing loss that her teacher had not assigned and had approved after a 20-minute conversation about how to structure it. She used a combination of spoken words carefully chosen, the ones she trusted her voice with and sign, and she asked Molly to stand beside her and interpret, which Molly did with the focused precision of someone who had been practicing for a year and knew that getting it right was not optional, because Rosie was counting on her. 3 kids in the class asked to learn signs afterward. One of them turned out to have an older brother with hearing loss who he had never told anyone about. Rosie came home that day and signed to Camille, "I think I want to do that again. Make people understand." Camille said, "You should." And then she said, "You're good at it." And Rosie, who was not a child, who accepted compliments without scrutiny, looked at her mother carefully and then nodded in the way she did when she had decided something was true. Tobias kept his old seal insignia in a lockbox on the top shelf of his closet at the new place, the apartment 3 blocks from Camille's house that he had moved into when the timing felt right and the distance felt right. Close enough that the girls could walk between the 2 homes, far enough that nobody was rushing anything. Molly had opined extensively on the distance question. She had drawn a map with approximate walking times annotated. She had presented it at dinner one evening with the air of someone presenting a business case, and Tobias had looked at it and then at Camille, and Camille had looked at it and then at Rosie, and Rosie had signed, "It seems efficient." The lockbox had been on that same shelf for 3 years before he opened it in front of anyone. He opened it in front of Camille on a Saturday afternoon in March, about 16 months after the corporate family event, where he'd crouched near a portable speaker and noticed a girl pressing her fingers behind her ear. They were sitting on her back porch in the not-quite-warm early spring, the girls inside doing something that involved a great deal of negotiation that they'd decided to conduct without adult input. And he'd gone to get something from the kitchen and come back with the lockbox instead. She looked at it. "What's that?" she said. He sat down and put it on the table between them. "Something I've been carrying around without being able to figure out what to do with," he said. He opened it. Inside was the insignia, the seal trident, worn, the gold gone slightly dull, and beside it, a small box within the box. The kind of box that was clearly a different category of object from the insignia. Camille looked at it. She looked at him. "Tobias," she said carefully. "I know it's fast," he said immediately. "It's been 16 months. I know. We haven't," she stopped. "We haven't talked about." "I know we haven't," he said. "I'm talking about it now." He paused. He looked at the porch railing rather than at her, which she had learned was what he did when he was saying something that cost him something. I'm not going to give you a speech. I don't have a speech. What I have is," he picked up the insignia, held it in his palm. "I kept this locked up because it represented the version of my life that I thought I'd lost. The part of me that knew what it was doing, that had a clear purpose. I put it away because looking at it hurt, and I didn't know what to do with something that hurt, and was also still true about who I am." She was watching him. "And now," she said quietly, "now I've spent 16 months building something that uses the same part of me, except it doesn't cost the same things. I go into environments and I find what's wrong and I fix it, and at the end of the day I go home to." He paused. "I go home, and there's something there. Someone there. People." He looked at her. "I didn't think I was going to get both. I thought that was the trade. You either do the work that fits who you are, or you have a life. I didn't think the geometry allowed for both. And now you think it does?" she said. "I think you've built something that makes both possible," he said. And I think he stopped again. Started over. "I put this away because I thought I'd lost that version of myself. But I don't think I lost it. I think it found somewhere different to be useful." He opened the small box. The ring was simple. Not a stone designed to announce itself across a room. Just a clean, well-made band with a particular quality of light in it. "I'm not asking you to change anything that's working," he said. "The girls, the 2 houses, the pace of it. I'm not asking you to rush anything or rearrange anything that doesn't need rearranging. I'm asking you something smaller than that and bigger than that at the same time." What are you asking? She said. I'm asking if you want to keep building this, he said. With me, formally, whatever that ends up looking like. She looked at the ring. She thought about the morning of her 30th birthday, the 4 bites of croissant, the 11 emails before 9 o'clock, the drive home at 7:45, and the banner with the misspelled word across the cabinet. She thought about 5 years of fighting a battle she hadn't understood correctly because the right information had been buried in the walls of her own house. She thought about a man crouching near a portable speaker with his hands completely still on his knees. She thought about 16 months of building something she had not known how to imagine building. The Field Reality Program, Dr. Soren's referral folder. Rosie standing in front of her class with Molly beside her signing the words she trusted to someone else's hands because that was what trust looked like in practice. 2 houses 3 blocks apart, close enough for the girls to walk between them, far enough that nobody was rushing. She thought about sitting on a courthouse step in February, watching a pigeon navigate a wind gust, calling Tobias and saying, "I want to go home," and meaning it fully, knowing exactly where home was. Yes, she said, not the full weight of the yes, not a speech. Just the word, placed carefully between them on the table beside the lockbox and the worn seal insignia and the ring in its small box. He let out a breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They sat there on the back porch in the not-quite-warm March afternoon, and from inside the house came the sound of the girls' negotiation, reaching some kind of resolution, a burst of Molly's voice, and then Rosie's rare laugh, the one that happened when something caught her completely off guard, full and unguarded and brief. Tobias and Camille looked at each other. "Should we tell them?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "Give me 20 minutes where I know, and they don't." She understood that. The small space of a thing that is yours before it becomes everyone's. 20 minutes, she said. They were married in September, 13 months later, because Camille needed that time and Tobias didn't push it, and the not pushing was one of the 10,000 daily ways he had shown her who he was. The ceremony was small, by the standards of what Camille's professional life could have made it. 40 people. An outdoor venue that was not trying to impress anyone, a restored property on the edge of a state park, wood and stone, the kind of place where the setting did the work. Her sister flew in from Atlanta. Tobias's former commanding officer, who had driven 7 hours and said almost nothing but teared up quietly during the vows, in a way he was clearly hoping no one noticed. Dr. Soren was there. Martinez and Choi from the engineering team. 3 of the field technicians who worked under Tobias, who had bought their suits collectively and with visible negotiation about what constituted appropriate formality. The ceremony was conducted in both spoken English and American Sign Language. A certified interpreter stood to one side, and Rosie and Molly stood at the front together, not flower girls, not in that tradition just present, the 2 of them in dresses they had chosen themselves, which had been an event in its own right. Rosie wore green, Molly wore blue. They had apparently spent 45 minutes arguing about whether the colors clashed, and concluded that they did not, which was correct. Tobias had practiced his vows in sign for 6 weeks. He had practiced them on Molly first, which she had taken seriously and reviewed critically, telling him at one point that his facial expression was wrong, that sign language wasn't just hands, it was face. And his face looked like he was reporting data, and not like he was talking to someone he loved. He had worked on his face. When he stood at the front of that small gathering in September and turned to Camille, he signed first and spoke second, and his sign was still imperfect, and his J was still slightly wrong, and his face was open, in the way it almost never was in the presence of more than 3 people, open in the way of someone who has decided that keeping it closed here would be a dishonesty he wasn't willing to commit. Rosie watched him sign. She had positioned herself at an angle where she could see both his hands and his face, and she watched with the complete attention she brought to things that mattered. And when he signed the words, "I choose this family every day, without conditions," she pressed her lips together and blinked twice rapidly, which was something she did when she was managing something large. Molly reached over and took her hand without looking at her. Rosie led her. When it was Camille's turn, she had not planned to sign. She was not proficient enough. She had told Rosie she didn't want to do it badly in front of everyone. She would practice more and maybe at another occasion. Rosie had looked at her 3 days before the wedding and signed, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to mean it." Camille stood in front of the 40 people who mattered most to whatever her life was now, and she signed her vows to Tobias, imperfectly, slowly, with the look of someone who is translating from inside herself directly into a language her hands were still learning. She made mistakes. She corrected them without apology. She kept going. Rosie watched every word. Afterward, when the ceremony had concluded and the afternoon light had gone that gold that September insists on, and the 40 people had spread across the outdoor space with drinks and the particular ease of a group that has just witnessed something real, Camille found Rosie sitting on a low stone wall at the edge of the venue, looking out at the trees. She sat down beside her. They sat there together without speaking for a while, in the way they had learned to share silence over 9 years comfortably, without filling it. Then Rosie signed, without looking at her mother. "Were you scared?" "Yes," Camille said, out loud and in sign. "Of what?" Camille thought about it. "Of needing something," she said. For a long time I've been someone who didn't let herself need things she wasn't sure she could have, because the not having hurt, and so I stopped wanting certain things." Rosie turned and looked at her. "But you changed." "You change," Camille said, "when the thing you're protecting yourself from turns out to be the thing worth having." Rosie considered this. Then she signed, "I heard the vows." Camille looked at her. "Both kinds," she said, "both kinds. His sign and your sign and the voices. I heard some of the voices." "Which parts?" Rosie thought for a moment. Then she signed, precisely, each word deliberate, the part where he said "every day." Without conditions. Camille felt the weight of that move through her. "That's the part that mattered most to me too," she said. Rosie leaned against her mother's shoulder. Camille put her arm around her daughter and they watched the light change in the trees. And from somewhere behind them came the sound of Molly laughing big and clear and entirely without self-consciousness, and Rosie's mouth curved up at the sound of it, reflexive, the way it always did. "She's so loud." Rosie signed against her mother's arm, without removing herself from it. "Yes," Camille said. "I love it." "I know," Camille said. "Me too." There are things that nobody tells you about the work of loving imperfect people into a family. They don't tell you that it requires the same skills as finding a ghost frequency: patience, attention, the willingness to look at an environment, instead of assuming the problem is with the person. They don't tell you that the signals that matter most are often the quietest ones, the ones you have to stop making noise long enough to hear. They don't tell you that the moments you'll remember most are almost never the large official ones, not the signed agreements, or the formal proceedings, or the ceremonies with 40 people, but the small, particular ones that accumulate without announcement. A banner with a misspelled word. A library book open in a sleeping child's lap. A sign language alphabet practiced at a kitchen table over bad coffee that tasted like the cup it came in. 2 girls arguing about whether green and blue clash and concluding they do not. A man with his hands completely still on his knees, watching, noticing, refusing to look away from what he saw. The truth is that most damage happens quietly. It settles into the walls of places people live and works against them in frequencies they can't see, and the people it harms learn to adapt around it and call the adaptation normal. And the adaptation becomes so natural that they stop being able to imagine what it felt like before, what they sounded like to themselves before the interference, what they might have heard if the signal had ever been clean. And then something changes, and you find out, not who you might have been in some other life, not some idealized version of yourself, that the damage prevented. That's not how it works. The years are the years. The loss is the loss. You don't get back what was taken from you by someone else's indifference, and there's no clean accounting that settles it. What you get is the corrected signal. What you get is the equipment working the way it was always supposed to work, in an environment that is no longer fighting against it, and you get to find out what that actually sounds like. It doesn't sound perfect. Nothing sounds perfect. Perfect is a word for people who haven't done this kind of work long enough to know what they're talking about. It sounds real. It sounds like itself. It sounds like a girl saying a name out loud in an audiology clinic because she chose to, and a man signing vows with his face open in front of 40 people, and a mother sitting on a stone wall with her daughter in the September light, while somewhere nearby a voice laughs loud and clear and entirely without apology. That is the sound of it. That is what it sounds like when the interference is gone, and the frequency is clean, and the people you love are finally receiving what you have always been sending. One evening in October, exactly 2 years after a corporate family event on the grounds of a research facility, Tobias took Camille and the girls to a lake about an hour outside the city. Not a planned trip. He had mentioned it the night before, casually, the way he mentioned things when he'd been thinking about them for a while, and had decided to stop thinking and do. A cabin his former commanding officer had let him use before, quiet water, enough space for the girls to be as loud as they needed to be. They drove out on a Saturday morning that felt like the last truly warm day before winter made its actual intentions clear. Molly talked the entire way. Rosie sat beside her and watched the trees through the window and occasionally signed something to Molly without looking at her, which Molly by now responded to without breaking the thread of whatever she was saying out loud, because their communication had become the kind of bilingual fluency that looks effortless only to people who haven't watched the year it took to build. The cabin was modest. The lake was cold and clear and the color of pewter in the October light. The girls found the dock immediately and spent the first hour conducting experiments involving rocks and depth that had no scientific merit and complete emotional validity. Tobias stood at the edge of the water and watched them. Camille came to stand beside him. "This is where you come to think," she said. "Used to," he said. "Came here alone a few times when Molly was at her mom's and I didn't know what to do with the quiet. And now?" He looked at the dock, at the two girls lying on their stomachs peering into the water, at the late afternoon light, making everything look temporary, in the way that beautiful things do when you know the season is ending. "Now the quiet sounds like this," he said, "which is different." She took his hand. He turned his palm up and held hers without saying anything, and they stood at the edge of the lake while the girls' voices came across the water in pieces Molly's full and unfiltered, Rosie's rare and entirely her own, and the light did what October light does when it's running out of time. It made everything count. Tobias thought about a lockbox on a shelf and the version of himself he'd thought he'd lost in the slow, imperfect, daily work of discovering that it hadn't been lost, only waiting for somewhere worth bringing it home to. He thought about ghost frequencies and clean signals and the difference between the two, and how sometimes you spend years adapting to interference before you understand that adaptation is not the same as living. He thought about a girl pressing her fingers behind her ear at a corporate picnic, and the look on her mother's face when she thought nobody was watching, and a decision he'd made in about 30 seconds to say something instead of staying quiet, which was not a decision he'd always made correctly in his life, but which was, he was fairly certain, one of the ones he'd gotten right. Rosie, out on the dock, stood up and turned toward the shore. She signed across the water, large enough that they could see it clearly. "Are you watching?" Tobias signed back, always. She turned, ran 3 steps, and jumped into the October lake with the complete commitment of someone who has decided that the cold is worth it and is not going to second guess at the edge. The water took her. She came up gasping and laughing, which was all voice and no sign, and Molly jumped in after her without a second's hesitation, and the lake surface broke open around them both and then settled, and they were there in the cold, clear water, entirely alive. Camille made a sound beside him that was not quite a word. "I know," he said. She turned and looked at him. "You knew she was going to do that," she said. "I saw it on her face," he said. "You can always tell about 3 seconds before, when she's committed." "She gets that from me," Camille said. "I know," he said. "That's how I knew." She looked at him for a moment in the October light, this man who had walked into her life with an equipment case, and a quiet so deliberate it had once seemed like absence, and who had turned out to be the opposite of absence, a presence so specific and unhurried and attentive that it had taken her a year to understand she had been looking for it without knowing what she was looking for. She kissed him. He kissed her back. His hand found the side of her face briefly, the way it did specific, deliberate here. Out on the lake, Molly yelled, "Oh, come on. We can see you from here." They broke apart. Rosie, treading water, signed with great dignity. Very embarrassing. Tobias called back, "Jump in, and you won't have to watch." "We're already in," Molly yelled. "Then stop watching." Rosie signed, "Not possible. The dock faces that way." Camille laughed. It came out the way it did now, not careful, not managed, just the actual laugh. The one that had been there all along under the composure, and the 11 emails before 9 o'clock, and the 4 bites of croissant, and the 5 years of fighting a battle. She now understood she had partly been fighting the wrong way. The lake went quiet for a moment. The girls were swimming, easy and unhurried. The light was doing its October thing. Tobias kept her hand. The former Navy SEAL, who had spent years finding hidden signals in walls, had finally done the harder work, learning to receive the ones being sent directly to him, in plain frequency, without interference, from the people standing right beside him. He had been good at detecting what was hidden. He was learning daily, imperfectly, to recognize what was simply there. That was the work. That was all of it. That was enough.